I've crossed the halfway mark for my zine-a-month project, Serial Music. And all the time I've spent working on it has just got me thinking about all the time I've spent working on it and about what I wish I had known before starting this whole thing on 35mm. So today I want to talk about 3 things I have learned during the course of this project that, if I had known them earlier, it would have just made the whole production run that much more smoothly. And trust me, when you're working on a project that is guaranteed to take at least a year or probably more, you want it running as smooth as possible. I'd say I'm a decent archivist of my work. I double back up everything that I do, and I keep the hard drives in 2 separate locations. Everything I've done has basically been worked into the 2 branches of personal or commercial work, and that makes it pretty easy to find what I need quite quickly. As for my negatives, I kicked the shoebox method years ago, and I've been filing my negatives ever since, along with information like what month the images were made, what camera was used, the lens, and the film stock. Ticking all the boxes, right? Yeah, well, sort of. One fairly crucial bit of information that I left out was the roll number, which means I'm sometimes searching through hundreds of negatives just to find that one that I'm trying to scan. And because of the extra steps of holding up the negative to a window for some light or putting it on a light table, it just means the whole process is going a lot slower than it needs to. Plus, if you are using a light table, you need space for that, and that just adds a little bit of friction in there too. If I had simply included the roll number in my digital archives as well as my analog archives, then I would just be looking through maybe 36 frames at a time instead of sometimes up to a couple hundred frames at a time when trying to find my one image. And that would obviously just save me a ton of time and effort. 90% or more of the film processing that I've done for Serial Music was all done by this one lab in Seoul. I really like the people that work there. They're very friendly and welcoming, and they've provided a really valuable space for people to go and learn how to do their own scanning. But as I said about rescanning all my negatives for Serial Music, I've come to realize that the revolving door of friendly young staff that worked at this lab were not as precious about my film as I am. Look, negatives run the risk of getting a few scratches here or there. It's all part of it. But I got back so many negatives that were absolutely scratched to death that at one point I was fairly certain the negatives were getting processed by the dude from Scream. My film scanner has digital ice or like dust and scratch removal, and so that does deal with a lot of those scratches. But nonetheless, on some of the worst frames, I find myself spending sometimes up to an hour or maybe even a little bit more in Photoshop, just one by one going over all those different scratches. And it's just much more time consuming than it really needs to be. It's not like that for every one of the frames that I work on. But considering that across the 12 zines of Serial Music, there are 480 images, if even a small percentage are scratched to that extent, it just means I'm going to be spending a lot of time on the computer working on these scratches, which is just kind of like the mechanical part of photography and not like the really exciting part. I eventually ended up switching labs to a smaller, quieter, and in a few key ways more professional film lab. And of course, there are still a few scratches here or there that I need to deal with, but it's a lot better and it's been saving me a huge amount of time. I hadn't done much scanning before starting this project, and I walked into it with the presumption that self-scanning would arrive at an image that was basically the same as the lab scan, and that I could just print it a bit bigger if and when I needed. I'm scanning on a Nikon Coolscan 5000, which is old tech, but a really solid scanner. But after scanning and processing hundreds of frames at this point, I'm fairly confident that there will always be a difference between the look of lab scans and home scans. I'm not exactly sure why this is, and if you have any ideas, please leave it in the comments below. It would be helpful for me and for anybody else that might be watching this. But when self-scanning, I kind of struggled to reproduce the particular relationship between the colors that I found in lab scans. Now, this isn't always a bad thing. I've come to realize that a lot of the scans I was getting back from the lab had some pretty wacky colors. There were, of course, some colors that I liked though coming out of the lab scans. And while I spent a fair bit of time trying to accurately reproduce them in my own scans, I did come to the conclusion that it's really not the best way to be spending my time. Instead, I leaned into the colors that were coming out of my scanner, and I changed my kind of philosophy about how I edit them to try and maximize the good qualities of the colors that I was getting, instead of just always trying to imitate the look that I had been getting from my lab. And ultimately, self-scanning has helped me arrive at a kind of color profile that I think just looks a lot more natural and makes the image look a lot more like it actually did in real life when I shot the photo. And I think for me and for the project that I'm working on, that fits. It feels appropriate. Self-scanning has ultimately made it a lot easier to arrive at neutral, like natural, true-to-life colors. And I think that that is just much more appropriate for me and for the project I'm working on. Whatever you have to say about the film look, I want my images to have a natural quality to them. I want them to resemble normal life. All three of the lessons that I've learned can be summed up in one sentence. The learning curve takes time. It's been a slow process doing this whole project on 35mm, but little by little I've learned how to make things go faster, and by engaging with the bits of friction that I encounter and trying to learn from them, it's really just helped me adapt my process and put me on the right foot for the next project that I do. Serial Music Volume 7 is out now. Thank you again for watching. Have a good one.